What if I told you that complete silence can be more psychologically damaging than screaming or physical violence? That the absence of communication can actually rewire your brain in the same way as physical torture? Imagine this. You wake up next to your partner, ask a simple question, and receive nothing but cold silence in return. Hours pass, then days. They're physically present, but emotionally vanished. You start questioning yourself. What did I do wrong? Why won't they just talk to me? The anxiety builds until you're practically begging for a response. Any response. If you've experienced this, you've been subjected to one of the most psychologically devastating forms of emotional manipulation. The silent treatment. This information is more critical now than ever before, especially in a hyper-connected world where being left on read or digitally ignored has amplified this tactic to unprecedented levels. What I'm about to share is information most therapists aren't even trained to recognize. The underground psychological tactics that keep millions trapped in cycles of emotional abuse. Most people think the silent treatment is just someone needing space or cooling off. But what I'm about to reveal shows why it's actually a calculated form of psychological warfare designed to break you down from the inside out. Pay close attention to this next part. It's the game changer most people miss. The weaponization of silence. The silent treatment isn't simply someone taking space to process emotions. It's the deliberate use of silence as punishment, deployed to inflict emotional distress while maintaining plausible deniability. I'm not doing anything to you, they claim, while actively withholding the basic human need for acknowledgement. What makes this tactic so insidious is that it leaves no bruises, no obvious evidence of abuse. Yet psychological research has shown that being deliberately ignored activates the same regions of the brain as physical pain. Your brain literally can't tell the difference between physical and social pain. Let me tell you about Megan. After questioning her boyfriend's suspicious text messages, she experienced 3 full days of silence. He would walk around their apartment, eat dinner at the same table, and sleep in the same bed without acknowledging her existence. By day 3, she was having panic attacks, begging for forgiveness for something she hadn't even done. This kind of psychological dominance is exactly what silent treatment masters aim to achieve. Dr. Kipling Williams, a leading researcher on ostracism, discovered that even brief experiences of being ignored trigger an immediate threat response in the brain. But unlike physical pain, the psychological damage from silent treatment compounds over time, leading to depression, anxiety, and shattered self-worth. This isn't just someone taking space. It's emotional warfare disguised as passivity, the kind of psychological intelligence they don't want circulating freely, because once you recognize it, their power begins to crumble. The 3 dark stages of silent warfare. The silent treatment follows a predictable pattern, each stage serving a specific psychological purpose in breaking down the victim's defenses. While others remain trapped for years, you'll recognize these patterns instantly once I reveal them. Stage 1. The shock phase. When silence first descends, you experience confusion and disorientation. Are they just busy? Did they hear me? This uncertainty triggers your attachment system to activate, releasing stress hormones that put you on high alert. Your brain, hardwired to prioritize social connection as a survival mechanism, registers this sudden disconnection as danger. During this phase, you might attempt normal communication several times, growing increasingly anxious with each failed attempt. This is exactly what the silent treatment is designed to produce: a mounting sense of panic and insecurity. One client described it perfectly. It's like suddenly finding yourself in a maze with no exit. The longer it continues, the more desperate you become to find your way back to normalcy. Stage 2, the desperation phase. As silence continues, your anxiety transforms into active distress. You begin to replay recent interactions, desperately searching for what you might have done wrong. This self-blame is neurocognitively inevitable. Your brain would rather assume fault than accept the helplessness of the situation. This phase is characterized by increasingly frantic attempts to re-establish connection. You might apologize for things you didn't do, make promises, or even engage in behaviors that compromise your values. Anything to end the excruciating silence. What's actually happening is a powerful manipulation technique called intermittent reinforcement. By occasionally forgiving you and breaking the silence after you've sufficiently degraded yourself, the manipulator conditions you to work harder and harder for basic human acknowledgement. I worked with a high-powered executive who would confidently command boardrooms of intimidating businessmen, yet would find herself literally on her knees, begging for acknowledgement from her partner during his episodes of silence. That's how powerful this technique is. It can bring even the strongest personalities to a state of complete submission. Stage 3, the submission phase. The final and most destructive stage comes when silence has become a controlling force in the relationship. At this point, you've been conditioned to monitor your own behavior constantly, walking on eggshells to avoid triggering another episode of silence. Your authentic self becomes suppressed as your primary focus shifts to maintaining connection at all costs. The silent treatment has achieved its ultimate goal: complete psychological domination through fear. You've been psychologically programmed to surrender your power to avoid the pain of disconnection. A former client explained how this affected her. I stopped expressing opinions, needs, or anything that might upset him. I became a ghost in my own life, always watching for signs that silence was coming. The real me disappeared completely. Why silence destroys psychological health? This right here is why most people never escape the cycle. They don't understand the neurobiological hijacking that's occurring beneath the surface. The silent treatment doesn't just feel bad. It creates lasting psychological damage through multiple mechanisms that most people won't discover until it's too late. Rejection activates primal fear. Evolutionary psychologists have established that humans evolved to be ultra-sensitive to rejection because social exclusion once meant death for our ancestors. The silent treatment triggers this ancient survival alarm, flooding your system with cortisol and adrenaline while there's no actual physical threat to fight or flee from. This creates a trauma response without resolution. Your body remains in a heightened state of distress without any way to discharge the stress hormones. Over time, this leads to anxiety disorders, depression, and even PTSD-like symptoms. Silence corrupts reality perception. Without the normal feedback of human interaction, you begin to fill the void with increasingly negative interpretations. Your mind catastrophizes, assuming the worst possible reasons for the silence. This distortion of reality is neurocognitively unavoidable. Your brain demands explanations for emotional pain. I need to be straight with you about something critical. One of the most damaging effects is what psychologists call defensive self-blame. Because feeling helpless is so intolerable, victims often subconsciously decide that they must deserve the treatment. This self-blame creates deep cognitive distortions that persist long after the relationship ends. Consider Sarah, who endured her husband's silent treatments for nearly a decade. When she finally left the relationship, she continued to analyze her every action, constantly questioning if she was being too much or asking for too much. The exact phrases her husband would use to justify his silence. 5 years later, she still struggled with expressing basic needs in new relationships. The invisible damage extends to physical health as well. Prolonged exposure to silent treatment correlates with weakened immune function, digestive disorders, and cardiovascular issues. The constant stress activation literally damages your body's systems over time. The manipulator's playbook, why they do it. Understanding why manipulators use the silent treatment reveals just how calculated this tactic really is. These aren't just difficult people. They're psychological manipulation masters who've perfected the art of control without accountability. Control without accountability. Silence allows manipulators to punish you without having to justify their behavior. If confronted, they can simply say, "I just needed space," or "I wasn't ready to talk," maintaining the illusion that they've done nothing wrong while causing maximum psychological damage. It creates a power imbalance. The person withholding communication holds all the power, determining when and if connection will be restored. This fundamental inequality establishes dominance without requiring any actual justification or legitimate authority. It forces the victim to self-police. The threat of silence becomes so aversive that victims begin to censor themselves, becoming hypervigilant about potential triggers that might cause another episode. This self-suppression serves the manipulator's goal of compliance without having to explicitly demand it. You know what's crazy? Most people don't realize that the silent treatment also provides perverse psychological rewards for the manipulator. Watching someone become increasingly desperate for their attention gives them a sense of importance and power that many find addictive. The victim's growing emotional distress serves as evidence of their control and influence. Most disturbing is how silence magnifies the impact of eventual attention. When the manipulator finally decides to speak again, the relief experienced by the victim creates a dopamine flood that strengthens the traumatic bond. This neurochemical reinforcement makes the cycle increasingly difficult to break over time. I've worked with several reformed silent treatment users who admitted the rush of power they felt when witnessing their partner's mounting desperation. One described it as intoxicating to see someone so completely dependent on their approval. This insight into the manipulator's mindset is rare but invaluable for understanding what you're really dealing with. Recognizing when silence is weaponized. Not all silence in relationships is manipulative. How can you tell the difference between someone legitimately needing space and someone using silence as a weapon? healthy space has transparency. Someone who needs genuine processing time communicates this need. I'm feeling overwhelmed and need some time to think. Let's talk tomorrow. Weaponized silence offers no explanation or timeline. Legitimate space has boundaries. Healthy distance has clear parameters. Perhaps the person isn't discussing one specific issue, but remains engaged on other topics. The silent treatment is absolute, creating a total communication blockade. Normal cooling off serves resolution. Someone taking healthy space uses that time to process emotions and return to the relationship ready to resolve conflict. Silent treatment isn't about resolution. It's about power and punishment. The intent reveals everything. The purpose of healthy space is self-regulation and relationship preservation. The purpose of silent treatment is to cause pain and establish dominance. Duration exposes manipulation. Legitimate processing time typically lasts hours or perhaps a day. Silent treatment often extends for days, weeks, or even longer, far beyond what's necessary for emotional regulation. One clear indicator is how you feel during their silence. If you're experiencing escalating anxiety, confusion, and self-doubt rather than simply missing the person, you're likely experiencing manipulation rather than healthy space. Let me share an example that perfectly illustrates this distinction. Michael would tell his wife Jenny, "I need to process what happened. I'll take a walk and we can talk about this after dinner." He remained warm and connected on other topics. And when they revisited the issue, he was calmer and focused on resolution. Compare this to Robert, who would simply stop responding to Maria mid-conversation after she expressed a need or concern. The silence would last for days, during which he would ignore her completely, only breaking his silence when she eventually apologized and promised to do better. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Breaking free. Counter strategies that reclaim your power. The most dangerous aspect of the silent treatment is how it transfers your power to the manipulator. While others remain trapped for years in these painful cycles, you'll be implementing these underground counter strategies that most therapists don't even know about. Pay close attention to this next section. These aren't just theories. They're battle-tested psychological countermeasures that can free you from the control cycle. The psychological firewall technique. This approach creates a mental barrier between their behavior and your self-worth. When silence begins, immediately remind yourself, this is about their inability to communicate healthily, not about my value or worthiness of response. Document the pattern objectively. Note when the silence began, what preceded it, and how long it lasts. This documentation serves two purposes. It provides concrete evidence that counters the inevitable gaslighting, "I never ignore you," and it helps you recognize the manipulative pattern over time. A client named Mark used this technique to remarkable effect. By tracking episodes of silent treatment, he discovered they invariably followed any expression of his needs. This awareness broke the spell of self-blame and allowed him to see the manipulation clearly. Within 3 months of implementing this strategy, he reported feeling immune to the silent treatment's emotional impact. The redirection of emotional investment. This powerful strategy involves consciously relocating your emotional energy during silent episodes. Instead of fixating on the person withholding communication, deliberately invest in other relationships and activities that affirm your worth. The key is intentionality. Don't just distract yourself. Actively nurture connections with people who validate your reality and respond to you with consistency. This creates a psychological counterbalance to the manufactured scarcity of attention the manipulator relies on. This isn't about playing games or creating jealousy. It's about refusing to participate in the emotional starvation economy the silent treatment creates. By having multiple sources of connection, you dismantle the manipulator's leverage over your emotional well-being. I worked with a woman named Elise who transformed her response to her boyfriend's silent treatments by implementing this technique. Instead of desperately pursuing his attention, she would call a friend, attend a class, or engage in a meaningful project. Within weeks, the silent treatments that had previously lasted days began lasting only hours. The tactic was losing its power because she was no longer responding with the desperation he expected. The controlled response protocol. Perhaps the most powerful counter-strategy is calibrating your response to silence. The manipulator expects you to follow a predictable pattern: confusion, then increasing desperation, culminating in surrendering your power to regain connection. The controlled response disrupts this pattern by implementing a measured, consistent approach that neither ignores the behavior nor rewards it with desperation. Here's how it works. When silence begins, acknowledge it once in a neutral, non-accusatory way. I notice you're not responding to me. I'm available to talk when you're ready to communicate directly. Then continue your normal activities without making additional attempts to engage until they respond appropriately. This approach is powerful because it 1. Names the behavior without accusation, places responsibility for healthy communication where it belongs. 3. Demonstrates you won't participate in manipulation. 4. Shows you can function without their approval. This isn't about punishment or giving them a taste of their own medicine. It's about establishing that you require mutual respect in communication. The goal isn't to control them, but to maintain your own integrity and psychological health. A former client implemented this approach after years of responding to silent treatment with increasing desperation. The first time she used the controlled response protocol, her partner's silence lasted just hours instead of days. The pattern was disrupted because it no longer provided the desired control effect. This is the kind of psychological intelligence they don't want circulating freely. Once you understand these dynamics, their manipulation tactics lose power, and they know it. The ultimate counter-strategy: internal validation. The most fundamental protection against silent treatment's psychological damage is developing unshakable internal validation. The silent treatment derives its power from exploiting the human need for external confirmation of worth and reality. By cultivating strong internal validation, you create psychological immunity to this form of emotional warfare. This isn't something that happens overnight, but these practices build this critical internal strength. Reality anchoring involves regularly consulting trusted external sources to confirm your perceptions. Keep a journal documenting incidents objectively. Share experiences with trusted friends who can validate your reality. These external reference points prevent the reality distortion that silence often creates. Self-validation practices are daily habits that reinforce your inherent worth regardless of others' behavior. This includes recognizing your achievements without waiting for acknowledgement, affirming your right to respect even when it's withheld, and acknowledging your emotions as valid even when they're ignored. The boundary reinforcement system establishes clear internal and external expectations around communication. Internally, you define what acceptable treatment looks like. Externally, you clearly communicate these boundaries. I'm willing to discuss difficult topics, but silent treatment isn't acceptable to me. What makes these strategies effective is that they address the root vulnerability the silent treatment exploits: dependency on external validation. By strengthening your internal validation system, you become progressively more immune to this form of psychological manipulation. I worked with a client named Jason who transformed his vulnerability to silent treatment through these exact practices. After 3 months of dedicated internal validation work, his partner's silent episodes no longer triggered panic or self-doubt. "It's like she lost a superpower over me," he explained. "I still prefer when she communicates normally, but her silence no longer controls my emotional state." When to walk away. Recognizing the point of no return. There comes a point where the healthiest response to silent treatment is removing yourself from the situation entirely. These indicators suggest you've reached that point. Pattern recognition is key. If you've attempted healthy communication strategies and the pattern persists, you're dealing with an entrenched behavioral system unlikely to change. Manipulators rarely relinquish effective control tactics voluntarily. Escalation after confrontation is particularly telling. If addressing the silent treatment results in more severe or frequent episodes, this indicates a deeply ingrained pattern rather than unconscious behavior. Impact assessment matters most. When the psychological damage from remaining in the relationship outweighs the challenges of leaving, it's time to prioritize your mental health. The cumulative trauma of repeated silent treatment creates lasting damage that may require professional support to heal. Consider Andrea's story. After confronting her husband about his silent treatments, he escalated from ignoring her for days to disappearing for entire weekends without communication. This escalation pattern revealed his commitment to control above all else. When she finally left, she discovered journal entries from years earlier describing the exact same pattern. Proof that this behavior was deeply entrenched and unlikely to change. Leaving someone who uses silent treatment often triggers their most extreme manipulation tactics. They may suddenly communicate openly, make dramatic promises of change, or alternate between intense attention and renewed silence, all designed to maintain control. Preparation is essential. Before breaking free, secure your support system. Consult with a therapist experienced in emotional abuse recovery, and create a concrete plan for maintaining no contact through the inevitable manipulation attempts that follow separation. The aftermath. Healing from silence. Recovery from silent treatment abuse follows a predictable pattern, but understanding this journey accelerates healing. The initial phase often involves cognitive dissonance. You may minimize what happened, question your experience, or even miss the relationship despite the pain it caused. This is normal and stems from the trauma bonds formed during cycles of withdrawal and intermittent reinforcement. The recalibration phase follows as your nervous system gradually adjusts to life without constant threat. During this period, unexpected emotional responses are common. Anxiety without obvious triggers, hypervigilance about communication, or overreactions to perceived slights. These are residual trauma responses that gradually diminish with time and conscious processing. The rebuilding phase allows you to establish new patterns of healthy communication and boundaries. Many survivors benefit from deliberately seeking relationships, friendships and otherwise, with excellent communicators who respond consistently and respectfully. The final integration phase involves incorporating the experience into your personal narrative in a way that recognizes the trauma without allowing it to define your identity or future relationships. Many survivors find they develop exceptional communication skills and boundary awareness through their recovery process. Professional support significantly accelerates this healing journey. Therapies specifically designed for relational trauma, such as EMDR or PARTS work, can be particularly effective in resolving the deep psychological impacts of silent treatment. Let me tell you about Rachel. After leaving a 5-year relationship dominated by silent treatment, she initially experienced panic attacks whenever text messages went unanswered in new relationships. Through targeted therapy addressing the neurobiological impacts of her trauma, she developed a resilience to these triggers. 2 years later, she reported, "I can now experience someone being temporarily unavailable without it triggering my entire nervous system. That freedom is priceless." The silent epidemic. Why we don't talk about the silent treatment, despite affecting countless relationships. The silent treatment remains largely under-discussed as a form of emotional abuse. Several factors contribute to the silence about silence. Cultural normalization dismisses it as typical relationship behavior, rather than recognizing it as the manipulation tactic it is. They're just cooling off, or they need space, become excuses that mask the deliberate nature of the behavior. The invisibility factor makes it difficult to demonstrate to others. Unlike physical abuse, there's no visible evidence, just the psychological damage that accumulates inside the victim. Shame silences victims who fear being perceived as overly sensitive or dramatic. How can I explain that being ignored hurts this much? They wonder, not realizing the neurobiological basis for their genuine pain. This collective silence allows the behavior to perpetuate across generations and relationships. By naming and exposing the silent treatment for what it truly is, a form of emotional warfare, we begin to dismantle its power. This kind of psychological intelligence is exactly what manipulation masters don't want circulating. When their tactics are named and understood, their control begins to crumble. The power of voice, reclaiming your right to be heard. The ultimate antidote to the silent treatment is developing an unshakable conviction in your right to be heard. This doesn't mean demanding responses from manipulators. It means cultivating environments and relationships where communication flows with respect and consistency. Your voice matters. Your experiences are real. Your needs deserve acknowledgement. The silent treatment maintains its power through isolation and self-doubt. By sharing experiences with others who understand, you break this isolation. By developing strong internal validation, you overcome the self-doubt. Remember that manipulators use silence because direct communication would require justifying their position. Their silence often reveals the weakness of their stance more clearly than any words could. Your commitment to clear, direct communication demonstrates strength, not vulnerability. If you're currently experiencing the silent treatment, know that your distress is neurobiologically valid, not an overreaction. The pain you feel has been documented in research and experienced by countless others. You're not alone, and you don't deserve to be treated this way. If you've recognized your own use of silent treatment, know that changing this pattern is possible. Learning to communicate directly about your needs and emotions creates stronger, healthier connections than manipulation ever could. The path forward lies in breaking the silence, both the manipulative silence used as a weapon and our collective silence about this damaging pattern. By naming it, understanding it, and developing effective responses, we reclaim our right to relationships based on respect rather than fear. The silent treatment may be warfare without words, but with awareness and the right strategies, it's a battle you can win, not by fighting, but by refusing to play by rules designed for your defeat. And if you think this is powerful, wait until you see the next psychological defense technique I'll reveal in my upcoming video on trauma bonding. While others remain trapped in toxic cycles, you'll be equipped with the underground psychological knowledge that transforms victims into survivors and survivors into warriors of their own reality. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. This information is too valuable to lose to the algorithm.